Welcome back to the Code Wolf. Today we're going to explore vibe coding with the new GPT-5 model and add some new features to a fairly complex app. Now, every time a new AI model is released, it seems like there's this flood of new content showing how much more efficient it is at building the same old contrived app examples like to-do managers, URL shorteners, hiking apps with no checkout features, or really simplistic CRUD operation apps. But in the real world, it's obviously rare to build any of those as a developer. Instead, you'll most likely want to use AI to add or improve features of existing, complicated, and often messy apps. So in this video, we're going to add several new features to dbChat Pro. dbChat Pro is a free app on GitHub I've created over the past year or two for this channel to demonstrate various AI and development concepts. It lets you query your database using natural language by AI translating your prompts into SQL and executing those against the database. It supports many different database and AI platforms, a rich UI with many features, automated Azure service provisioning and deployment, and even an MCP server. In other words, it's complex enough to challenge an AI model, but manageable enough for demos. So let's get started and see what GPT-5 can do. All right, so let's start by taking a quick look at the app that we're going to be working with, just so that we're on the same page about what this app does and what kind of the user flows are and the different high-level features. I'll show you the basics of how to get this set up in a second. There's plenty of other videos on my channel that go into more depth with how this app works and even how to build parts of it, but let's just get an idea of what we're going to be working with through our GPT-5 prompts. So when you start up this app, the first thing you actually have to do is go over here and add a connection to a database. I've already added a connection to an Azure database, but you would just plug in your database type. So this supports these 4 platforms right now. Then you give it a name and a connection string. And you actually don't need a demo database set up ahead of time for this video to follow along, because one of the features we'll add first is hooking this up to a SQLite database. So we'll see how to do that. So don't worry if you don't have a database. But I've just configured this to connect to one so I can show kind of how the app works. And so on this main dashboard, it says chat with your database, and you can pick your platform. I have 2 of them configured here right now, so I'm going to choose OpenAI and that GPT-5 model. And here's where we enter in our prompt. So I'm going to say, get me 10 customers. Over on the right, we can see our schema for our database. So get me 10 customers, that's going to map to this customers table. So it should bring back some results there. And then we also have some other options here like history and favorites and so on. So I'll say submit. And the AI thought about it for a second and then pulled back our table of results. So that's kind of cool. We can see those different customers and their email and so on. The app also shows you the SQL that was generated by the AI to run this request, and the app executed it. The AI never has direct access to the database. It's just generating queries that are then run by the app itself. And then there's an Insights tab that gives an explanation of what the AI, or how the AI came up with these results and what its thought process was. Down here, there's some formatting and favorite and export options, and feel free to play around with this however you'd want. But there is a decent amount going on here for our AI to digest. So if you want to follow along with this demo, you can pull down the dbChat Pro app. So the source code is all here, and the app is free. And you will need .NET 8 installed locally because this is written in .NET and Blazor. And you'll also need a key or access to one of these supported AI platforms. For simplicity, if you're new to the app, I would definitely recommend either OpenAI or GitHub AI models. All you need is an API key essentially, and you'll be good to go. So you can wire up to your model. These other ones require a little more configuration, but Ollama is also an easy option if you want something that's free and fully local. And of course, there is a full README here, so I'm not going to go into the details of everything. You can check this out for whatever configuration you want to run with. So you'll just want to clone down this app or download the zip and open that up on your computer. And that should look something like this when you pull it down. And then I've opened that up in VS Code because I like the AI experience in VS Code. So here's that same folder just open in VS Code. You will also need the GitHub Copilot extension installed in VS Code, obviously, as well. So for dbChat Pro, there's 3 projects. There's a core project that contains most of the business logic or app logic, if you will, and some of the models and things like that. Then this app also actually has an MCP server, so you can talk directly to its functionality. It exposes some tools for GitHub Copilot. We're not going to worry too much about that, but we are interested in the UI project. So this is what we just saw in the browser. And to get this running, there's actually just one configuration. So you need to open up this app settings.development.json file. So I already have that open in the middle here. And then down here where it asks for keys or endpoints and so on, basically you just have to provide the key for whatever platform you want to use. So here I'm using OpenAI and an Azure OpenAI endpoint, and that's why those two showed up in the UI. But for example, if all you have is an OpenAI key, you would just plug that in here, or a GitHub AI model key, plug that in here, and those will show up in the UI after you add a database connection as well. So you can use those AIs to tinker around. So check out the README for more information, but this is basically exactly what I did to get the demo running, like we saw before. And if you don't have a database to connect to, we'll look at that in the next segment, and I've included some links in the description for an easy SQLite database. All right, so the first feature we're going to add to the app is an example of probably the most common type of feature request I see for this app in the comments and so on. And so if we go over to our connections page, right now you can add a database connection to these different types of databases. So it supports SQL Server, MySQL, Postgres, Oracle. And so these are four of the most popular, but obviously it's always great to add support for more. And I've been working on that with each version. But now let's see if we can just have our AI just quickly add support for another database type. And the one that I've chosen for this example is SQLite. So this is a very popular technology that's often used in development and testing, but SQLite is also used in more production type scenarios, I guess I would call it, on mobile phones and other devices where just some sort of lightweight self-contained database is needed. So SQLite is definitely a useful technology. Let's see if we can add it into our app here. So let's go back to VS Code, and I am going to be using GPT-5 for this, so we can test just how powerful that model is. So in our context here, I'm just going to say hello to make sure our AI is up and running. And for this video, I'm going to do my best to kind of streamline these conversations without editing out any important context or causing you to miss anything in this AI flow. But we'll see how this goes. So I'm going to say something like, add support to this app for SQLite databases. And I'm intentionally keeping this prompt very simple. I'm curious to see what it kind of comes up with from this simple request, and if it can read into that and understand the context of the app and everything it would need to do to implement that kind of feature. It is interesting to see how it's kind of thinking through this. So you can see it's reading the UI layer, and it already looked at some of our more core logic services with our CS files and such. So we'll see where this ends up by the end of its process. And so it finished its work, and it actually wrote out a summary of what it did here. So for example, it's saying SQLite service implemented, done, manager routing for SQLite, done, DI registration, done. So I like that it kind of gives this summary of everything that it came up with, but it also broke down the actions that it took by the different projects. So here's the changes it made in the core project. So this dbchatpro.core, as well as the UI project. So you can see we're just talking about registering DI and adding some different UI elements here. But the part that we're interested in is these 7 files changed down here. So first let's look at the CS proj. So it did add the SQLite package, and it looks like that was the only change to the CS proj file. So I'll keep that one. And then we jump to the next file it changed. And here it updated our database management service. So this is the service that decides which of the different database services should be used to handle the user's actions. And so it's injecting in a new SQLite database service, which didn't exist before. I'm sure we'll get to that in a second with this diff. So I'm going to keep those. There's our dependency injection update in our program file, so I'll keep that. And now it's actually updating our UI fields. And what's interesting about this is that, again, this is Mudblazor, so it probably doesn't have as much training on this, or nearly as much training as it would with something like React. But it was smart enough to understand that it needs a SQLite item, just like we have these other database items. And then there's some other updates down here, but I'll just accept those. And same here, so there's another kind of enum thing here, so it's adding SQLite to that. And it even updated our sample connection strings files. So this is just a file that gives the user examples of what the connection string should look like for each database they're trying to connect to. So that's great. It even updated some of our informational files, so I'll keep that. And now here's kind of the main SQLite database service. So it's actually opening up a SQLite connection, and it's mirroring the structure of those other files, but it's just updating them for SQLite. and I'll just close this out of here so we can see more. But if I compare that to something like our Postgres file here, you can see the structure is almost the same. So we have this get data table and we have this generate schema. Well, we have those same methods here in the SQLite file because all of these database services implement this iDatabase service interface. So it was smart enough to figure out that it has to implement this, and then it kind of mirrored the logic of those other ones, but updated for SQLite. So I'm going to keep that as well. And now let's actually test if this works. And we get our familiar dashboard, so we know the app is at least working and running. And now let's go over to our connections page. And we see this database type now includes a SQLite option. So we know at least the UI element here is working, and I'll call this SQLite test. And I actually downloaded SQLite onto my computer ahead of this so that I have this available with this Chinook database. So this is kind of a common sample SQLite database that's out there. So we want to plug in a connection string here, but let's use the example that it actually gave us in that sample connection strings file. So we're using a file-based database, not an in-memory one, so we'll want to use this as kind of our sample template. So I'm just going to copy this URL out of here and paste that over this sample URL. And then that was chinook.db, I think. So now let's take this connection string and go back to our UI. So I'll paste that in there and we'll see if the connection works, and there it is. So this is connecting to our SQLite Chinook test database, and we can even see the columns and everything like that. So I'll hit save, and that continues to work. So now back on our dashboard, we can see that this SQLite test database did show up. And I've configured this app to use Azure OpenAI. This has nothing to do with our changes that we made with the AI model. This is just something you need to get this app running with AI. So I have a GPT-4o model deployed. So over here on the right, we can see our schema. So I'm going to say something like, get me the albums. And it looks like I had left a breakpoint here, so I'm just going to click continue. And there's our albums. So this is pretty impressive. It actually updated our entire app to support SQLite. Even though I already knew how to do this from implementing the other 4 databases, just kind of the manual grunt work and figuring out the different nuances and making sure I have all the right configurations and packages and so on, it looks like this already did a pretty good job, and I could just further refine whatever it created, or maybe it's already good to go. Okay, so for the second feature, I want to try to implement a really specific feature request that I've received a few times, which is the ability to add sort of a system prompt or kind of manual text or context to the prompt that gets sent to the AI. So obviously you can kind of type in whatever you want here as a prompt to query the SQL and have it generate a SQL query. But what if we just want to give sort of background or just general context instructions to the AI? We don't really have kind of a dedicated box to do that or anything. So let's see if we can get our AI to add that in for us. So let's go back to VS Code and I'll stop our app. And I've just kind of cleaned up our environment here and started a new chat with our AI. And I'm just going to paste in a feature request here. So I'm saying add the ability for users to be able to add custom text to the constructed AI prompt to give the AI model more context. So I'm just going to send that and see what it comes up with. And it immediately starts searching and trying to figure out what to do. And again, we're getting these step-by-step instructions. So I'm going to let this run. We can see over on the right that it had to update 4 files for what it thinks is needed for this. But it looks like it's still working and kind of finishing up, so we'll see where this lands. And there it goes, it wrapped up. So it gave us some notes, and it even talked about how to use the feature that it created. So it says on the home page, enter the main prompt. And it gives us an idea of what actions it took. So it scanned the code base, and then it implemented a model change, a UI change, a service change. But it looks like it did a good job kind of scanning through this. So let's see what it came up with. So first it's updating our form model here with an additional context property. So this will probably store the data the user enters in the UI onto this property. So we'll keep that. And now it's updating this get AI SQL query method. So if we create a little more room here, this get AI SQL query method, this is the one that authors kind of the main prompt that gets sent out to the AI to translate the user's query into a SQL query and bring that back to the app. So you can see it's adding some additional instructions into that prompt. So if the additional context they enter in the UI is not null, then it's saying the following additional context has been added by the user, and use it to tailor the query and summary. So what I find impressive here is that it was able to understand kind of the gist of what this app does, where it's kind of constructing this big prompt to send to the AI, and it changed the structure of that prompt just a little bit to allow for this new context. And it's even doing some enhanced error handling here as well and some other cleanup. So I'm going to keep these changes. And then we go over to our UI. So it created a new mud text field. So it's updating our mud Blazor UI. We definitely want to keep this. And then finally, this is the update to that MCP server that we're not really going to worry about right now. So we kept all those changes, and now let's go over and run our app again to see if this is actually working. So on our main homepage dashboard, I just configured this to use the new SQLite support that we added in the first feature. So I just hooked up to that database again. That has nothing to do with this new feature. The new feature that we're interested in is right here, actually. So it added this form field. Remember, this was not here before. And so we have this additional context option, and it gives us an example of business rules, filters, definitions. So here's where we can give extra instructions to the AI to tell it what to do. So I'm just going to do something simple here. I'll just say, make sure the insights description reads as though it was written by a pirate. Just something obvious so we can see if this is working. And then for our actual prompt, I'm going to say, get a list of 10 customers. And we get an error. It looks like I didn't select the Azure OpenAI platform and give this a model, so I just forgot to fill these out. Should really add some validation for those. So let's say submit, and then we get our customers back. So here's 10 of those. But if we switch over to the Insights tab, you'll see that here it's actually written like a pirate. So it says, ahoy, I be fetching the first 10 customers from the customers table by plundering their details without any conditions. So this was sent along in our prompt, and it actually worked, and now we're able to provide some really simple context to send along with that. Okay, so for our third prompt, I want to do kind of a logic-only feature and see if the AI can understand things like server-side validation or security measures or just ways to improve kind of the integrity of our app and just improve this workflow of querying the database and connecting to it. So I've written up this additional feature, and this is called SQL Guardrails. This is something that's also been requested in different comments from different people. And this is to this is to enforce that the app only allows select operations on the database for safety. So right now, technically in the app, you could have it try to do create operations and update operations and potentially even drop and delete. The app isn't really structured that way, so it probably won't work very well. It's really designed as more of a read-only app. And you'd want to enforce that by putting permissions at the database level on the user that's actually executing those queries. However, it would be nice to have an additional layer of security where the queries are sort of being checked to make sure that they're not even trying to do drop or deletes or anything like that. So I'm going to tell it to limit the app to only allow select operations. And again, this is not sort of a bulletproof solution for this because there's always ways to kind of get around AI guardrails a lot of the time. But let's just see what it comes up with to kind of improve the integrity of this app. It's certainly better than not having it at all. And so as it's thinking, it kind of scanned through all of these different database services to try and figure out what it should do. And now it's saying it's going to add a shared SQL guard and wire it into all of the get table methods, which is called by each of these services. It's defined on an interface they all implement. So it's even trying to be efficient about how it implements this feature so that it doesn't do that on every single database service individually. It's going to try and apply that globally to all of them. So let's see what it comes up with. Now this feature might have sounded simple on the surface, but you can see it actually had to change 7 files here to get this working. And so if we kind of look through here, there's this new SQL guard class, and it looks like it's using a regex to kind of search for harmful phrases. So it says ensure select only. And so it's looking for different characters and different types of checks. So it's not just doing a simple search for select and decline it. It's actually going through a whole banned word list and making sure none of these are in here. And this is actually a ton of logic. This actually might be an example of AI kind of going overkill. So I'm sure there's probably a simpler way to check for all of this, but let's keep it for right now just to see if the feature actually works. So I'll say keep, and it looks like it's going through all of those different database services and calling that SQL guard ensure select only method. So I'm just going to keep all of these, And so notice our new SQLite database service that was created in an earlier feature is also getting updated here. So there it is. So we kept all of our changes. And now let's run the app and kind of mess around with this to see how this works. I'm not exactly sure how this will play out, but let's give it a try. So this time, let's just make sure this is still working in general. So I'll say, get me 5 albums. And you can see our additional context feature is still there as well. So we're kind of progressively actually building more and more into this app. And there's 5 albums, so the basics of the app are still working. And so now let's try and do something harmful here to the database. So I'm going to say remove 2 albums and click submit. And we get an error of only select statements are allowed. So it actually didn't allow us to remove those albums. And if we look at the Insights tab, it is kind of giving general information about how you'd remove those albums. So it's giving us some delete guidance here. So if I just switch this to say delete 2 albums, it still gives us an error and it doesn't execute that. So that's good. But if we try something more drastic, like drop the database, the infamous error that AI models can make, and I'm going to say submit. And here it gives kind of a strange error. Query is empty after removing comments. Only select statements are allowed. So it still didn't run it, obviously. And here it actually gives us insights that in SQLite you cannot drop an entire database directly as you would in other database systems. It says instead you would delete the database file itself from the file system to achieve this. So that makes sense since we are using this Chinook.db sample database, so we can't just drop that. So let's say get the count of albums. Probably should have done this first, but it says that there's 347. So if I say, again, get rid of 2 albums, it's going to give us an error that only select statements are allowed. And so now if we actually go over into our history and run get the count of albums again, there's still 347. So this is working. I would argue this feature is a little bit awkward in terms of the error reporting, and I'm pretty sure that SQL Guard class, that this could probably be simplified. All right, so for this next feature, I really want to focus on a little bit more involved UI work. For 2 reasons. One is that UI can just be kind of complicated in general because between styling and UI logic and making sure that the component or piece fits in with the rest of the UI, it can actually be pretty complicated for AI models. So one feature I want to look at expanding is this favorites. I just ran a query to get 5 albums, and you can see our other features are still in place. So we're still hooked up to SQLite, and we've got our additional context option and so on. But when we click this favorite, right now you do get this little toast notification. And if we go over to our favorites tab, that does pop in here. And if you click on it, it'll actually rerun that query. So this is nice, but if you plugged in a long prompt or something with a lot of information, it just kind of truncates or trims the prompt itself as the name. And it would be nice if you could actually give this a custom name and maybe tag it or categorize it or just do something to make these favorites a little more readable. Because once you have, 50 of them or so, that's going to get pretty confusing to just kind of read the raw prompt. So I'll close out of here and just stop our app. And I've got a new chat set up with our Copilot over here. And I'm going to paste in this new feature. So it says when the user clicks to add a favorite, show a dialog that lets them name and add tags to the favorite. And there it goes to work again, kind of just scanning the project and getting a sense of what it wants to do first. So it's kind of reading through the history and the query service, and it's kind of finding the right pieces again, so that's good. But let's see what it comes up with. So this one seems to be challenging for Copilot. It's asking me if it should continue because it's been working for a while, so I'm going to say yes, and we'll come back when this finishes. All right, so it finally finished, and this one took about 7 or 8 minutes. This was definitely the longest one. It seemed to kind of struggle with this, but let's see what it actually came up with. And it had to change 8 files for what it thinks is correct. And so this first one is the history item. So history and favorites both work off of this history item. So we're going to keep these changes. So it's adding this tags and name properties. So this will probably allow the user to assign values to those properties. So I'm going to keep this. And then it's going to add parameters to the query service for those new properties. So I'll keep that. And so for favorites and history, there's actually an in-memory service that stores them. And then there's another one that's compatible with Azure Table Storage. So this is updating the in-memory service so that while you're browsing the app, it continues to remember the name and tags or continues to remember those items, but it's adding those new properties on them. So we'll keep those. And now this is the Azure Table Query Service, so it's updating this as well. And now it's creating a Mudblazer dialog to allow the user to enter in the name and tags. And so it's injecting the dialog service up here. And so we've got our cancel and save operations as well. So this looks like a pretty standard Mudblazer component. So we'll see how that holds up. So now on the home page, it's injecting the dialog service. I'm just curious to see if this one actually worked. So it updated a lot of stuff here. Let's actually just run the app and see what it came up with or what this looks like. So we're back in the UI. I'm going to enter in a quick prompt here to generate some results. So there's 5 albums for us. Now let's see what happens when we click this favorite button to see if it actually updated this correctly. So it does open up a dialog, but this is pretty awkward looking. It plugged in a default value from our prompt. So this is get 5 albums. I'm just going to call this test save or something so that it's different from the original prompt. And now for the tag, we can add whatever we want here. So I'll say albums 5 count or something like that. I don't know what's going on here with these headers, but I'll click save and we still get our toast. Now over in our favorites, this actually was updated correctly. So it pulled in the name we entered of test save, and it's also displaying the albums and the count of 5. So now if we click on that, it does still run the query. And so it looks like all of this is working properly. Now, I'm not a huge fan of this, but this is a good example where the AI probably did 80% of the work here, and now we have all the pieces we need to go back in there and just start editing and kind of refining what this looks like. So please consider hitting those subscribe and like buttons, and I'll see you next time right here on the Code Wolf.